Okay, another topic I want to treat now is a topic that deals with decolonizing African past, African history. So this deals with the question which is I read until Europe penetrated Africa, the greater part of the continent was without the wheels, the plow, and transport, almost without stone houses or clothes except for skins, without writing, and so without history. Comment with reference to pre-literate Africa. So this question is basically talking about the nationalist historiography. All right, no, whether national the debate between nationalist African historiography and the European historiography. You will recall that the one major argument debate between Africanist historians and European historians beginning from the middle of the 20th century was a debate or question about whether Africa had a past before the coming of the Europeans into Africa. Several Eurocentric scholars like Trevor Roper, or even Ranke had argued that Africa was a place of darkness, with primitive and barbarous, uncivilized people, populations. In the words of Trevor Roper, which I like to quote, who says Africa resides in an unhistoric region of the globe with unrewarding gyration of barbarous tribes in pictures and relevant corners of the globe. That until the coming of the Europeans, the people in Africa, in the words of another a girl, WFG a girl, they were half human, half beast. All right, so there was no development. Of course, the absence of literacy, the absence of Western education in Africa was interpreted to be lack of motion or development in Africa. So this is the essence of this question. So it is for you to prove yourself, to argue for or against. So it is a question in historiography, which has been there. If you have read the works of the pioneer Africanist historians from Ibadan, from Kenneth KODK, Kenneth Uka Dike, who wrote his PhD thesis on trade and politics in the Niger Delta, or the works of Professor J.F. Adiajayi, the Christian missionary activities in Africa, and the works of people like Saburi Biobaku, E.A. Ayondele, J.C. Anene, and quite a number of Africanist scholars from Ibadan who had written extensively to debunk the erroneous view of these Europeans, which was not only a misconception, but which arose from the a palpable ignorance of the historical anthropology of Africa, by just insinuating that Africa didn't exist, that there was no development because there was no literacy. So what you need to do in this question is to analyze, show some evidences. All right, this one is a blend of historiography and political and economic history of Africa. So you need to be on with some information of development in Africa before the coming of the Europeans to marshal your point. So you need to demonstrate that Africa had some level of development before the coming of the Europeans. That Africa was never primitive, was not underdeveloped, was not a barbarous place before the Europeans came. Before the Europeans came, that the people of Africa had their social, economic, and political structures and institutions, through which their development. So every civilization determine the level of development. They define their own development. So these are some of the things you do. So if I was asked this question, how will I attempt the question myself? It's so simple. So I'll just give a broad discussion about the state of Africa before the Europeans came. A careful investigation of the social economic and political history of Africa, especially West Africa particularly, reveals a record of continuous achievement, stability, and sufficiency in every sphere of life before their encounter with the Europeans from the 15th century. So I'll start proving my point now. By the first millennium of the Christian era, a succession of organized societies had appeared in central and eastern Sudan and developed into viable states and empires and kingdoms. Some of these kingdoms are the Kanem, Bonu, Kanem, the Ghana, the Mali Empire, which was one of the, if you have read the inaugural lecture of Professor Ademola Adeleke, if you have read his inaugural lecture, in fact, that is enough to demystify the Eurocentric account. No, the story of Mansa Musa, who put Africa on the global map even before the 15th century, as far back as the 11th century, who traveled across Europe, dispensing the wealth of Africa and placed Africa on the global map. So if the Europeans claim that Africa was not a developed place, and the amount of gold which Mansa Musa took from Mali to Europe on his voyage to Mecca was a significant component of the factors that led to the European economic development before the 15th century itself. So there are other instances. I mentioned Kanem, the Ghana, which became very powerful. Others, in the process of formation, such as those as the Hausa states, the Songhai, the Benin, the Tekro, were less extensive, but they also had indicators of development, of civilization and modernity before the Europeans came. Africans had evolved various political systems, ranging from the extreme democracy of the stateless societies of the centralized form of governance, of the kingdoms and empire, whether you talk about Mali or the Kanem Borno or all of that. So they were this centralized, a very sophisticated political entity which had been formed centuries before the Europeans came. Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, witnessed the birth and growth of such powerful empires such as Mali, Ghana, the Kanem, Oyo Empire, the Benin, among others in West Africa. Just as there was also the emergence of the Leo Babito Kingdom of Bunyoro Kitara in East Africa, the Baluba in the Congo in Central Africa, and several other forms of political organizations were in existence before the Europeans came in the 15th century. These are kingdoms that were dated back to 5th century, to the 8th century to the least. So among the oldest homogeneous groups in the Sudanese, in West Africa, for instance, the Kanuri people had occupied a special place in history, in world history. All right, so their origin dates back to the period after the desiccation of the Sahara. That's millions of years before. So why would the Europeans assert that Africa where it was nothing greater than a place of wheels, the plow, without transport, without stone houses, without clothes, all right, and without writing. So you have to contend with the Europeans measurement of development through the indicators of writing, westernization, Western education. You have to contend with this Eurocentric pegging of development with transport system, with clothes, and with stone houses, architectural sciences and all of that. So you have to show some of these variables that existed in Africa, which I'm going to give you, a few examples before I conclude. For instance, the Kingdom of Ghana was located in the northern part, peopled by the Soninke, who were in contact with the white nomads of the Sahara. They were linked, they shared links, among various other African people through political contact. So to demonstrate that Africa was not a place of barbarous people or primitive or uncivilized people who were naked, you have to show that even so diplomatic relations existed among contiguous states, No, but some of the states, an empire forged relations through expansionist policies also, such as conquests and all of that. But the point is that diplomatic relations existed between all of these states. Apart from that, each of these pre-colonial African states had a sophisticated, a well-organized political system of governance, which are highly decentralized and highly democratic in structure. So if you mention the Buyoro Kitara I've mentioned, you've mentioned the Ghana Empire, you've mentioned the Kanuri Empire, the Kanem, the Hausa states. So look at the level of sophistication of their political systems, or your empire, for instance, which was ruled as a constitutional monarchy, based on checks and balances, with the Oba, all the elements of modern day presidential, democratic system existed among the Yoruba people, where you have the executive, legislative, and the judicial functions, checking each other. Do you understand? So each of these pre-colonial African political entities was formidable enough to challenge external threats, from within and outside, their territories. And the development of trade and commerce was also an important impetus in the expansion of the states and the development of their institutions. All right. But although territorial expansion was usually motivated by the desire, to extort tribute and all of that, we know all of this. But the fact that apart from the political structure of these pre-colonial African entities, they had commercial and economic systems through which they sustain their empires and kingdoms. Economically, as a result of observable observation of an experiment, the pre-European African entities, they had evolved a stable system of food supply that was independent of any external source, before the coming of the European. So these are some of the points you must analyze in responding, in debunking this Eurocentric account, Eurocentric, perspective about Africa. Okay, because these are some of the efforts made by the pioneer Africanist historians like Kennedy, Ajayi, and the likes. So, in addition to the economic, improvement in Africa, there were varieties of, rice as well as cereal and yams and tuber cultivated in the sub-region without external prompting, without the European intervention. Before the 15th century, when the contact with the Europeans was established, none of the people of the different pre-colonial African states lived in isolation of others. I've mentioned that there were diplomatic connections, among each other. Of course, the physical environment determined the nature of the people's economic and material production. For instance, the people in the riverine environment, their economic activities was, shaped by the availability of waters, all right, such as, which enhance their production of salt, fishes, and all the stuff, canoe, and what you like. So the dwelling people, those dwelling in the mangrove areas, produce salt. They produce, salt fish, and they exchange all of these with people who live in the forest areas and the savanna regions. And this was the nature of organization in Africa. So you use all of these points to debunk the Eurocentric account, which state that Africa, before the European came, were just without wheels and plow. They didn't even do that. Means that they didn't even have no agricultural implements. That means, the impression is that they were Stone Age people. So you have to demonstrate. So for people to have elaborate system of agriculture, even hunting and fishing, goes beyond, the issue of primitive. So they were not primitive. They were not in any way uncivilized. So other economic activities which the people in Africa, were smithing, were salt making, wine tapping, and a wide trade network. All right, which involved not only daily or periodic market but also long distance trade. Of course, you have to also, establish, cases from, if you have the ability to establish your case with examples from various kingdoms in West Africa. All right. So there are also other ways in which you could also analyze this question, apart from the political. So the European allusion that West Africa were no, there were no transport, there were no plow. Yet the people in Africa, organized a very, very viable, trade system, which was known as the Trans-Saharan trade system, through which African commodity got as far as China and Europe, even before the 15th century. So the Kano textile, the Yoruba, clothes, adire, and all the stuff found their way, to east to North Africa and to Europe and as far as China, even before, centuries before the Europeans came in the 15th century. And these are some of the, important, points you must note in trying to understand. So there were local banking systems, in various parts of Africa. There were, financial institutions which through which people could regulate their economic activities before the Europeans came in West Africa. In Katanga, in Zambia, they made use of copper as a means of exchange, for instance, white cowries and gold and manilas and other stuffs were used in various parts of West Africa. Even in terms of education itself, Africa had its own informal system of education before the coming of the Europeans. This is another point through which you can use to debunk the European assertion about Africa being a place of darkness, without clothes, without transport, without literacy. Before the Europeans came, indigenous education served to prepare young men and women for their prospective roles in society. It doesn't have to be Western education. So it was an informal or traditional system of education, which was given within the community by members who possessed specialized skills in or abilities in various fields. So in most traditional communities, for instance, the introduction of formal education, before the introduction of formal education, boys were brought up to take up their father's vocation. In some cases, they were sent to live with other men as apprentices to learn various vocations and life etiquette. For instance, if one's father was a farmer, fisherman, or blacksmith, there was the likelihood that the boy child in that family too would become a farmer, fisherman, or or a blacksmith. So children learn the trade of their parents, although occupations varied according to the geographical, areas in Africa. But the major ones, were farming, trading, craftsmanship, fishing, cattle grazing, palm wine tapping, traditional medicine, blacksmith, and what have you. These were some of the, these were the indigenous system of education in Africa before the contact with the European. The male children were trained in this occupation. So they were also trained in other activities such as archery, tree climbing, wrestling, and oratory. Why there were also specialized jobs for the women or the girls in African society. So this shows to debunk the fact that Africa had no sense of development or were just bunch of barbarous people. Now, when you look at it socially, also, they were African society was socially organized. All right. So, in a way that there was less anarchy and less disorganization. Pre-colonial African society was well structured, based on communal systems of living before the Europeans came in West Africa. For instance, every society is made up of various, clan. You have lineages, all right. Then you have household. Among the Yoruba, for instance, a household consisted of a man, his wives, children, and relatives, such as the immediate and extended members of his lineage. So the word family in pre-colonial African society was weightier, than in what it was in when the Europeans came. All right. So this was because the people lived communally with no trace to individualism or capitalism. Although social stratification and class differentiation could have logically occurred at some point, but the gap between the rich and the poor was not very wide. Social stratification was minimal. That's the point. So people focus more on collective development of the family than on the personal individual accumulation of wealth. All right. So, there was a deep sense of communalism and mutual trust, obligation, family obligation, with reciprocal social system. All right, in the African society, for instance, land was not commercialized. So this unwritten social theory arguably enhanced inclusive development and social orderliness and cohesion, in Africa before the Europeans came. And these are some of the points you use to debunk the Eurocentric assertions about Africa, being a place without wheels, plow, without transport, and without no clothes and without writing. So life in development is not no uh, a prerequisite, was not contingent on writing. Western education or Western literacy is not a determining factor of development or civilization. So you could give all of these explanations I've given above to show that Africa was, had their own indicators of development before the Europeans came. Or even though there were a little lacuna here and there, all right, but Africa was well organized. They had their own indigenous system of education, which I've mentioned. As a matter of fact, I would stretch, that aspect more importantly, in terms of historical reconstruction, there were professional custodian of historical reality in each African society who recounted, who are the reciprocity of historical events. So these people, in the absence of Western literacy, Western writing, all right, schools, so they documented, they preserved their knowledge, their history, through various oral evidences and oral traditions, through songs, through myths, through storytelling, proverbs, through cognomen, and drawing, artistic representations, and all of that. So these are some of the means in which Africa, recorded their own level of development in before the Europeans came. And to use the word of Claude Ake, he noted that societies in Africa were invariably patrimonial and communal and highly developed. Everything was so regulated by the pre-colonial African kingdoms and states before the Europeans. So the idea that Europeans were the one who introduced law was quite strange because standards of accountability were even stricter than in the Western society in pre-colonial African states. Chiefs were answerable not only for their own actions but also for natural catastrophes such as famine, epidemics, flood, and drought. So this shows the level of decentralization. Of course, if you have studied Oyo Empire, you'd have seen the level of organization in colonial African society such that the Oba Alafin could be removed just by mere protest by the people who probably considered him to be unruly, to be dictatorial in his rulings. So this question will be properly tackled properly by the ability to debunk the European assertion about Africa. That is what the question is about. You have to demonstrate through a number of economic, social, and political development in Africa. That Africa was not a place without wheels, without plow, without transport, without stone house, without writing. All right, so Africa had all of these structure. There were architectural designs and architectural building structures in Africa before the Europeans came. They had their own indigenous or traditional cloth production, textile manufacturing before the Europeans came. So, all of these goods had found their way to Europe before the 15th century through the North African traders. And all of these, are some of the issues you must really emphasize to be able to do justice to the question.